Joining us to discuss more on the conflict, Trita Parsi. He is an Executive Vice President of Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Thanks so much for joining us, Trita. Now,
thank you.
Just following off from this last report, do you think that there is a chance of a two-state solution between Israel and Palestine, or has that ship sailed now?
Well, I think on the one hand, the fact that the policy that the United States has pursued has been one to essentially try to move beyond the two-state solution, move beyond the Palestinian issue by doing all of these normalization deals. That has been a tremendously negative development that has worsened the situation and has helped bring about the violence that we're seeing today. But I don't think we can say that a two-state solution actually is impossible to achieve if the leading countries, including the United States, shift their position. If they're willing to shift their position, I think there still is a small chance that it can be revived. If there is no shift, we are going to see continued violence and instability, because there is no way that you can have 2.2 million Palestinians indefinitely live under occupation in Gaza, and even more so in the West Bank, and then simply accepting that they will never have the same rights as humans have everywhere else in the world.
So what kind of position does the US need to have then? Wasn't it the US that was behind the Saudi deal that was going to bring Israel closer to Saudi Arabia, which supported a two-state solution?
No. What the United States did there is to essentially take away the biggest leverage that some of the Arab countries had, because the Saudi position prior to this was the Arab Declaration from 2002, the Beirut Declaration, in which all of the Arab states would recognize Israel in return for an Israeli recognition of a Palestinian state, leading to, of course, a two-state solution. The United States has been pushing many Arab countries, succeeding with some, and now latest with Saudi Arabia, to try to get them to drop the demand for an Israeli recognition of a Palestinian state and only go forward with their recognition and normalization with Israel. And this would lead to the continued shoving the Palestinian people under the rug and pretending as if they're not there. And many people have warned that this would lead ultimately to more violence, because the Palestinians are obviously not going to accept that type of a treatment. So in many ways, the United States itself has actively pursued policies that has made the two-state solution under the current circumstances impossible. If the United States were to shift its position, that a possibility can reemerge.
So in terms of the current situation now, we've just heard from our reporter on the ground there, targets now don't just include Gaza. We're looking at Syria, Lebanon, the West Bank. What do you think this means for the conflict in general, and how dangerous is this, and how many players could it bring into the mixing pot?
This is an extremely dangerous situation. It's also reflected in the manner that the United States has been urging its own citizens to leave these countries, because it recognizes that the risk of a massive escalation is now quite palpable. And that is an escalation that would bring in Hezbollah, Syria, potentially Iran and Egypt as well. And that in and of itself would increase the likelihood that the United States would get sucked into yet another war in the Middle East. What is mysterious under these circumstances, in my view, is that the United States is doing nothing publicly to put pressure on Israel to not escalate and to move towards de-escalation and a ceasefire. Because if the assumption is that these countries, these other countries in the Middle East, can indefinitely watch Israel bomb the people in Gaza and not intervene, that is a lethal assumption. That is very similar to many of the other bad assumptions that the Biden administration has based its Middle East policy.
So explain that for us. Why is the US so hesitant to call for a ceasefire? And, what does that mean in terms of players like Iran? Does that mean that the US will then not really get involved until perhaps Hezbollah and Iran get more involved?
I think the Biden administration's calculation or strategy is to think that by showing a lot of support for Israel, it will pay off well domestically here in the United States politically, and that will give the Biden administration some cachet to be able to, at some point, theoretically put pressure on Israel to cease hostilities and de-escalate and agree to a ceasefire. What we've seen from statements by the Israelis themselves, for instance, some of the humanitarian help that Israel has agreed to, they have said that this is as a result of pressure from the United States, and that Israel is in no position to say no to the U.S. Well, that raises the question. If that is the case, that the Israelis are not in a position to say no to the U.S., why doesn't the Biden administration ask for a true de-escalation rather than just sending in a very tiny number of trucks with humanitarian help, rather than actually ending the fighting? According to Israeli statements, they have no ability to say no to the United States if the U.S. actually were to ask.
So given everything that's happening right now in terms of this foreign policy and the politics, do you think that Israel runs the risks of being isolated, especially if it then commits a ground invasion? And if it is isolated, what does that mean for the situation?
Well, I think what we're seeing again here is that it's Israel and big parts of the West that get isolated because just in the last 10 days or so, there's been a complete shift. And initially, the sympathies worldwide, of course, were with the Israelis who were victims of Hamas's incursion and attack and brutal killings in there. And as soon as the Israelis started bombing rather indiscriminately and killing more than 4,000 Palestinians, sympathies have shifted. There's now big divisions in Europe. Officially, most European countries are siding with Israel, arguing that it has a right to defend itself. Some of them not even saying that that self-defense has to be within the confines of international law, but that much of the European public is not on board with that, and some European countries have broken from that consensus. I think if there is a ground invasion and we see continued bloodshed and slaughter of innocent people who are not militants, who will have no choice but to be where they are in Gaza, then there is not only a significant risk that it will isolate Israel, but I think also many Western countries are going to find it increasingly difficult to justify their policies in Ukraine and elsewhere to the broader global South.
Right. We don't have a lot of time, but just in terms of Egypt, why is it so hesitant to let Gazans in across the Rafah border? Is it just because they're concerned about the influx of people on their territory, or is there more to it?
Yeah, I think there's more to it. On the one hand, the Egyptians hardly can handle that, and we're talking about potentially 1.1 million people crossing over into Egypt. That's not a small amount of people. I mean, so that in and of itself is self-explanatory as to why they're not particularly excited about that idea. But there's also the fear that once they have left, they will never be able to return. That Israel would either annex parts of Gaza, as some Israeli officials said, that the territory of Gaza is going to shrink after this war. What exactly does that mean? But also perhaps because the Israelis who control Gaza, despite the fact that they're not militarily inside of it, would not allow them to return. And that would be a significant problem for Egypt in the long run.
All right, we'll leave it there. Really appreciate your time there. We'll be speaking to you very shortly. Absolutely. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.